Hi class, welcome to our lesson 4, lecture 1. Today we are covering a good deal of information that you really need to know in terms of language choices for speeches and also using visual aids. And our language choices can be vital to our effectiveness as a speaker. So I think it's very important to talk about that and make sure that you are using language in a way that works for you as a speaker instead of a way that works against you. And also we'll be talking about visual aids and ways to incorporate those into your speeches and so forth. Okay, so why are a speaker's language choices important? Well, that's actually a really good question. Language helps us to create a sense of reality by giving meaning to things and events and of the like. So our language choices are a vital part of the speech making process. Now the language we use can help to form or even determine our own responses. So language is at the heart of, for the most part, everything we do as a speaker in terms of the content. Words are the tools of a speaker's craft and have special uses, which we'll discuss a lot more in this meeting. Now, can this help us outside of public speaking? Yes, very much so, yes. The language choices that we choose in our communication can help us in many different aspects of our life, but it can definitely help us in our professional and personal lives as a whole. It helps us to avoid accusatory statements, which we know can be detrimental in our relationships. It helps us to avoid miscommunications with others. The language choices that we decide to make are, they can carry a great deal of miscommunication, and we want to work to try to avoid that. They could also help us to better manage or even convey our emotions or feelings, and they can just help us to be more successful as a whole. All right, so let's talk about the meaning of words. Denotative meanings are the literal or meaning of a word or a phrase, and these are often found in the dictionary. So if you decide to look, you're searching for its denotative meaning. Connotative meanings of words are the meanings suggested by the associations or emotions triggered by a word or a phrase. And this gives words their intensity and their emotional power. Connotative meanings, they arouse in listeners feelings of anger, pity, love, fear, friendship, nostalgia, greed, guilt, and just so much more. So connotative meanings are those emotions that are triggered by a word or a phrase. And I wanted to give you an example of that to really picture what I mean. But let's say that I use the word home. Well, if we looked up that word in a dictionary, we'd have its very literal and straightforward dictionary definition, which would be the denotative meaning of that word. However, the connotative meaning of the word is usually very, very different. Connotative meanings can greatly differ as we all draw from our own frame of references. So while I think of the word home and I think of it being a warm and cozy and comforting and loving place because that's my frame of reference for it. Your frame of reference might be totally something different. For instance, perhaps you grew up in a very unstable home environment and perhaps you had to move a lot. So your definition of home just is different than mine. Not necessarily in a negative way, just different. And that's okay too. But that is the connotative meaning of a word. Now, choosing words skillfully for their denotative and connotative meanings is a crucial part of the speaker's craft. So, what meanings are the best choice? Well, it's not so simple as to answer denotative or connotative here. It really just depends on the audience, the occasion, and even the speaker's purpose. For example, so like I was saying, choosing words skillfully for their denotative and connotative meanings is just a crucial part of the speaker's craft. So, it's not as easy as saying I should use the connotative or I should use the denotative because it really just depends on your audience, your occasion, and even just the speaker's purpose as a whole. So an example here would be, let's say that you wanted to rally people for a cause. And quick question, what type of speech would that be? That would be persuasive, right? Because we're advocating. So we want to rally people for a cause. Well, generally in that case, we would want to use connotative meanings because if we're rallying people, we want to stir their emotions and we really want to, get them thinking about things from an emotional standpoint. So we're going to use connotative meanings there. But if we're discussing a controversial issue and we want to seem really impartial on it, then we're probably going to use denotative meanings because we don't want to rouse emotions when we're wanting to seem impartial. So it really does just depend on the audience, the occasion, and even the speaker's purpose. But using language accurately is a vital part of the process, like I said, and it is vital to a speaker. It's just as vital to a speaker, as using numbers is, accurately, at least to an accountant. It is a part of your craft. So when used incorrectly, language can destroy your credibility. A good rule of thumb that I like to tell my students is, when in doubt, consult a dictionary or a thesaurus to make sure that you are choosing the best words to express your ideas. And real quick, most of us already know this, but just in case, a thesaurus is just a book of synonyms. So we want to make sure that we're using our words correctly so it does not affect our credibility. So how can we use clear language choices? Well, first, we always want to strive to use familiar words. Don't try to go outside of your comfort level, and definitely don't try to go above your audience's vocabulary level. We want to make sure that we are reaching our audience members and not talking over them, because that's not something that a responsible speaker would choose to do. We also want to work to choose concrete words and, using abstract words sparingly. Concrete words, by definition, are just words that refer to tangible objects. They're often better at claiming the listener's attention. Abstract words are words that refer to ideas or concepts. They are much easier to misinterpret than concrete words, so we want to try to use concrete words instead of abstract words. We also want to eliminate clutter. Clutter forces listeners to hack through your words to finally, at least hopefully, discover your meaning. So we want to eliminate that clutter. Get to the point. Be concrete, be concise, and be accurate. We want to avoid unnecessary jargon. And we have discussed that before, but I did tell you in that meeting that we would revisit that word. And we want to avoid jargon. And jargon is a specialized technical vocabulary that serves the interests and activities of a particular group. Now, I want to give you an example of jargon. I worked in the hospitality industry for many years, and in fact, one of the businesses that my husband and I own is a hospitality company. It is, well, actually, it's a property management company, but we do work a little bit in the hospitality side as well. So one, or actually two phrases that come to mind in terms of the hospitality industry, two pieces of jargon there, would be front of the house and back of the house. And if any of you have ever worked in the hospitality industry, specifically in restaurants, then you would know that front of the house is going to deal with servers, hosts and hostesses, people that really have hands-on experience with the customers that come in. Back of the house are going to be people that are cooks, preps, dishwashers, people that really keep things running so that the servers, hosts, and hostesses can do their jobs properly. So if I were to just to mention this in my speech and say front of the house and back of the house and start throwing those phrases around in the speech, well, chances are that most of you are not going to understand that, because you're not that is not a field that you have experience in. So we want to avoid jargon unless we're talking, let's say, at a conference that has to do with hospitality. We definitely want to try to avoid jargon so that we make clear language choices and do not confuse the listener. We want to avoid language that privileges one group over another one. And things that we really want to strive to avoid are sexist language. That's going to be language that negatively influences the way listeners perceive men or women. We want to avoid non-parallel language, and that's language that does not treat the two sexes equally. We also want to avoid ageist language, and that's language that negatively influences the way listeners think about older people, and that's by definition, but I also think that could be younger people as well. Ageist language, to me, works either way. We also want to, of course, avoid racist language, and that's language that privileges one racial group over another. And this is language that I hope you choose not to use anyway, but certain things they do fall into these categories and we don't even realize it, so it's important to note these things. And of course, we want to always avoid stereotyping other people, because we miss out on some wonderful people and some wonderful things when we choose to stereotype. But let me be a little bit more specific with this. We want to work to avoid, in our language choices, creating invisibility. And a good example of that is the generic he. An ineffective wording choice for a statement might be, each time a surgeon walks into the operating room, he risks being sued for malpractice. A more effective way of handling that statement to avoid creating invisibility and avoid using that generic he would be, whenever surgeons walk into the operating room, they risk being sued for malpractice. You see how we basically just pluralized the words here to avoid creating that invisibility. We also want to avoid demeaning language. And a lot of times people say things and I think they say them and they just don't think them through. So you want to avoid demeaning language, and that might be saying, the old lady, or sometimes we just say stupid things like dumb blondes or computer geeks. Well, that's demeaning. It's very demeaning. And if that language were turned on you in some way, it would probably bother you. So why would we use it on someone else? We also want to avoid dismissive language. I hear individuals say all the time, oh, she's just a typical female. That's why she's so emotional. Or he's just a man. He never listens. We want to avoid dismissive language. It's not language choices that an educated person should choose to use. So we want to avoid that as a whole. We also want to avoid undue emphasis on differences. I'm not sure why people do this, but a lot of times you'll hear people say, they'll point out differences of other people that's really not relevant. For instance, I'll hear students say, instead of my professor, they'll say, my Asian professor, or my African American professor, my black professor, my white professor. I'm not sure why people point these things out if it has no relevance in the conversation, and generally it has no relevance in the conversation. So we do want to avoid these things. Why are we making each other different? Aren't we the same? I mean, if we really get down to it, aren't we the same? So avoid that type of language. We also want to strive to use language vividly. If your goal is to move people in a speech with your language, if your goal is to move people with your speeches, you want to use vivid, animated language. Two of the most important ways to do this is by using imagery. And imagery is the use of vivid language to create mental images of objects, actions, or ideas. It could even be places or things. We can do this by, concrete words add to the imagery of language used by creating these sensory impressions. And I'll go into this in a lot more detail in just a moment. Also, rhythm. Rhythm is the pattern of sound in a speech created by the choice and arrangement of words. So imagery and rhythm are two important ways that we can really just make use of language in a vivid manner. So let's, really dissect these two terms, though. Speakers can use imagery in much the same way as a good novelist does to make their ideas come alive. We've all sat down and read a good book, or even listened to an audiobook and heard the writer just make these words come alive in a way that makes us feel like we're there experiencing that with them. 3 ways to generate imagery are using concrete words, which we just discussed. We can also use, simile is an explicit comparison introduced with the word like or as between things that are essentially different yet have something in common. It's a very confusing definition in my opinion, so I want to give you an example so you understand it. An example would be, walking into my childhood home is, keyword there, is like being wrapped in a warm security blanket. So the simile, like I said, is an explicit comparison. So simile is an explicit comparison introduced with the word like or as between things that are essentially different yet have something in common. And the key word in that statement that I just went over is like. So walking into my childhood home, again, it's essentially different than a warm security blanket, but I've used the word like to make this explicit comparison. So walking into my childhood home is like being wrapped in a warm security blanket. Now, a metaphor is a little bit different. It's an implicit comparison not introduced with the word like or as between two things that are essentially different yet had something in common. So it's similar to a simile, but it's an implicit comparison, and it's not introduced with the word like or as. So a good example of that is, America's cities are the windows through which the world looks at American society. So America's cities are the windows through which the world looks at American societies. Okay. So we also want to, with imagery, we want to avoid cliches. And cliches are just a trite or overused expression. For example, a cliche might be, the towel smelled fresh as daisies. Or, I moved around as busy as a bee. We don't want to include that stuff in our speeches because it's just very trite, it's overused, and it's just kind of blah. Now, another way that we can use vivid language in a speech is to create rhythm. And like I said, a rhythm is the pattern of sound in a speech created by the choice and arrangement of words. So language has a rhythm by the way we choose or choose to arrange our words. For example, I've got an example here that I want to go over. And here's an example of rhythm by Winston Churchill. We cannot tell what the course of this fell war will be. We cannot yet see how deliverance will come, or when it will come. But nothing is more certain than that every trace of Hitler's footsteps, every stain of his infected and corroding fingers, will be sponged and purged, and if need be, blasted from the surface of the earth. So you see how we used rhythm there to not just choose our words, but also to arrange the words in a way that just creates this vivid imagery, vivid language choice that makes it come alive for us. So rhythm can be a very powerful thing. How do we create rhythm, though? You know, it's kind of a little bit like poetry, isn't it? There are 4 basic stylistic devices which can be used to create rhythm in a speech. And those things are going to be parallelism, repetition, alliteration, and what was the 4th one there? Oh, antithesis. I'm sorry. Lost my train of thought there for a minute. So parallelism is basically the similar arrangement of a pair or series of related words, phrases, or sentences. A great example of parallelism is, I speak as a Republican. I speak as a woman. I speak as a United States Senator. I speak as an American. And that's a quote by Margaret Chase Smith. And so you see there how we have a similar arrangement of words, and that is that parallelism that I'm speaking of. Okay. The next one could be using repetition. And repetition is a reiteration of the same word or set of words at the beginning or end of successive clauses or sentences. So we're reiterating the same word or the same set of words at the beginning or end of successive clauses or sentences. A great example would be, if not now, when? If not us, who? If not together, how? That's Gordon Brown. So you can see there how we are reiterating the if not, if not, if not. And that is how we are creating repetition. Alliteration is where there's repetition of the initial consonant sound of close or adjoining words. A good example of that would be, nothing great is accomplished without cooperation, compromise, and common cause. So we are using repetition of the initial consonant sound. It would just be the co here, I guess is how you would say that. But nothing great is accomplished without cooperation, compromise, and common cause. And then we have, let's see here. And then we have antithesis. An antithesis is basically just a contrasting of ideas, usually in a parallel structure. For example, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And that's John F. Kennedy. And that is, like I said, that's just basically just using your words that are, using it in a way that's contrasting ideas, but it's used in a parallel structure. Okay, so creating rhythm, if we really look at these things, it can be done, and it's not as difficult as we might seem. So basic criterion for the effective use of language in public speaking is be accurate. We always want to strive to be accurate with our information. Be appropriate. Being appropriate is something that sometimes gets overlooked, but being appropriate to the occasion, the topic, and also your audience is vital in public speaking. We want to be concise, be clear, be concrete, and be interesting. Basic criterion for that. Okay. So the delivery methods, we've already went over the delivery methods, so I'm not going to go into that yet again for you because I know you're going, okay, I know, but just don't forget that the delivery methods are manuscript, memorized, impromptu, and extemporaneous. And extemporaneous is used because it's just more adaptable to more situations than is from the speaking from manuscript. And extemporaneous is what we use in this class. Nonverbal communication. Okay, so you have to remember that your speech is not just consisting of verbal communication, but it's also nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication is communication based on a person's use of voice and body rather than the use of words. Don't forget that when a speaker's body language is inconsistent with his or her words, listeners often believe the body language rather than the words themselves. So it's very important that our verbal communication matches our nonverbal communication. And the previous example that I used for this was, let's say that you are having an argument with your significant other, and your significant other asks you, are you okay? And you say, I'm fine. But your arms are crossed on your chest, your face is squinched up, and you say it in a way that says, I'm fine. Well, we know that, first off, the verbal message that we're giving off is not consistent with our nonverbal communication. And in that situation, I would hope that your significant other would believe the body language rather than the words themselves, like most of us would. The speaker's voice. These are a few things I do want to cover here because it does pertain to that nonverbal communication, and it can affect the way that your message is perceived. So the aspect of the voice of a speaker should work. The aspects of the voice that a speaker should work to control are volume, and volume is just basically the loudness or softness of the speaker's voice. So we always want to work to project our voice so that people in the back of the room can hear us clearly. If you see people leaning towards you or kind of having that look on their face of not quite sure what they said, try to speak up a little bit. It could be that your volume is just too low. Pitch. Pitch is the highness or lowness of the speaker's voice. So, you want to think in terms of inflections. We want to work to have changes in the pitch or tone to avoid being monotoned in the speech. And that's my next point. When we're monotone, we have a constant pitch or tone of voice. So we might sound like this the entire time we are doing our speech because we're sounding very monotoned. Well, that is something we want to avoid. It actually reminds me of Ben Stein, the Dry Eyes commercial, if you've ever seen that, where he goes, dry eyes. Okay, well, that's being monotoned, and it's not keeping the audience's attention by any means. Then we also want to work to control our rate, and that's the speed at which a person speaks. I'm not sure that I've ever had anyone speak too slow, but speaking too fast is a very common thing. So try to control that rate, try to be conscious of it, and try to speak at a rate that is clearly understood by your audience members. And then pauses. Pauses are also a good thing. They can also help us to control our rate. Pauses are just a momentary break in the vocal delivery of a speech. Now, one thing we do want to avoid, though, is vocalized pauses, and that is also called verbal fillers. You'll hear me refer to that a lot as verbal fillers. And vocalized pauses or verbal fillers is a pause that occurs when a speaker fills that silence between words with vocalization, such as or or and so. Those are things that we often use as a vocalized pause. You want to avoid that. Just remember that it's okay to have a pause, a momentary break in the vocal delivery of a speech, but we want to avoid vocalized pauses. Vocal variety is another thing that a speaker should always work on, and that's going to be changes in the speaker's rate, pitch, volume that give the voice variety and expressiveness. They just make a speech more dynamic as a whole. We also want to work on pronunciation and articulation. Pronunciation is the accepted standard of sound and rhythm for a word in its given language. So pronunciation, having proper pronunciation of all the words in your speech is absolutely vital. without having proper pronunciation, then you risk losing your credibility with your audience. Articulation is the physical production of a particular speech sound. So a good example of poor articulation would be saying have to instead of have to. So I might say, I have to go and, well, you're not have to anything. I have to. I have to. Dialect. Dialect is it's a variety of a language distinguished by variations of accent, grammar, or vocabulary. Now, do you have to speak like a news anchor, to control dialect? Well, no. Just know your audience, and when in doubt, avoid regional dialects. So an example of that might be, let's say, for instance, a Southern politician in a northern state. Well, that Southern politician is probably going to choose to control their dialect a little bit more because they're in an area where their dialect might not be clearly understood. However, if they were giving a speech in the South, then they might allow their regional dialect to be a little less controlled because that's their audience and that's their setting. Okay, body language. Body language is a very important part of your delivery. So why is body language so important? Well, like I've said before, when a speaker's body language is inconsistent with his or her words, listeners may believe the body language rather than the words themselves. So let's say that you decided to describe yourself as an energetic and enthusiastic person. You were introducing yourself to a group of people. Well, if you said, I'm a very enthusiastic and energetic person, well, it doesn't sound like it, does it? So people probably aren't going to believe that about you because your body language is so inconsistent. Now, the major aspects of physical action that will affect the outcome of your speeches are going to be your personal appearance. Be aware of that when you deliver your speeches. What does your personal appearance look like? Do you look like you're a credible, well-researched, responsible speaker? Also, your movements. Are you fidgeting? If you're fidgeting the entire time, it's very distracting. So you want to work to not fidget. Also, eye contact. We want to use eye contact by definition is direct visual contact. I underlined direct there. Direct visual contact with the eyes of another person. We want to make sure we're making short bits of eye contact with all of our audience members. Never get stuck on one. And like I've said in previous lectures, you don't want to focus on a back point of the room. You don't want to focus on someone else's forehead or some other random thing like that. You need to be making direct visual contact with the eyes of another person or other people in the audience. That's how we keep audiences engaged and interactive. And people can tell when you're not doing this. Also, we need to use gestures. And gestures are motions of a speaker's hands and arms during a speech. But do remember to focus on communicating, and your gestures will generally just take care of themselves. Try not to focus too much on the gestures. But since this is an introductory class, I do want you using those gestures, starting to incorporate them. Keep in mind that I do know that you're going to be a little apprehensive about this at first, and you might not be the most natural at using your gestures yet, but you will get used to it the more you use them. Don't put your hands behind your back. Don't put your hands in your pockets. Don't slap your hands by your side and never move them. We want to use controlled, small gestures as this makes our speech more dynamic. Okay, now I talked about this in a previous lecture. In this course, we will not be using question and answer sessions at the end of our speeches or even during our speeches. Just not something that I want you to do in this course. However, you could use this in your career one day, so I do think it's something that I should talk about with you. We want to always, if we decide that we're going to need a question and answer session, I'm going to call it a Q&A session. So there's a little bit of jargon there for you, but I did define it, so I think we're good. We want to prepare for the Q&A session. And to prepare for a Q&A session, we can formulate answers to possible questions in advance. This will help us to be better prepared when those questions might be asked to us. We can also practice the delivery of your answer. So not only did you formulate your answer, but practice the delivery of your answer as well. We also can better manage a Q&A session by approaching questions with a positive attitude. Don't sound negative when you have to answer a question. If you want a good example of that, watch the interviews often given by athletes. We have some that are very positive with their answers. We have some that are well rehearsed, have formulated answers in advance, and have practiced those answers. And we have others that are not positive. They're very negative. They don't want to answer certain things, or they're just not prepared. So that might be a fun little activity for you, is just to kind of check that out if you're interested in sports. Also, we can better manage our Q&A sessions by listening carefully. We can direct answers to the entire audience instead of just the person that asked us that question. We also want to be honest and straightforward with our answers as much as possible, and also work to stay on track with our answers. Don't beat around the bush. Stay on track, answer the question if you feel comfortable with it at least. Okay, let's discuss visual aids for a little bit though. Why do we use visual aids in speeches? You'll be using visual aids in in your demonstration speeches. You might choose to use them in a student choice speech, an informative speech, or even your persuasive speeches. But you'll definitely be really manipulating the visual aids when you demonstrate something and so forth. But visual aids have 4 major functions. They help to support complex information. They help to emphasize or reinforce important ideas. They relieve monotony, and they keep the attention of the audience. They also appeal to different learning preferences. So visual aids can be a great thing to use in your speeches if used properly. Make sure to only display visual aids while you're discussing them though. And the reason we don't want to display them completely throughout the speech is because they can be a distraction. People might tend to focus on your chart or your graph that you have up, or your photo, or whatever it is that you're using for a visual aid. They may choose to focus on that and tune you out as a speaker. Now, this does not apply in our demonstration speeches though, because if you're cooking something, you're going to need to go ahead and have that stuff out. If you're demonstrating to me how to do whatever, you're going to need to be prepared and have that out. So that's okay in this class. Doing a demonstration during your speech can reduce nervousness by providing an outlet for that extra adrenaline. We've talked about extra adrenaline being a source of the speaker anxiety. So when we demonstrate things, we are able to move around a little bit, and it reduces our nervousness. Other types of visual aids, though, might be an object of some type, a model. A model is basically a replica of an object that you can't easily bring to the speech. For instance, if you're doing a informative speech on the history of the Statue of Liberty, well, we can't bring in the Statue of Liberty to class, but we could bring in a model of the Statue of Liberty. Photographs and drawings are great visual aids to use as well. Photographs can have a lot of emotional power if you're doing persuasive speeches and so forth. Just don't be too extreme with whatever it is that you decide to use for a visual aid, because if we shock the listeners, then they might shut down on us. So just kind of something to always keep in mind with visual aids. Charts. Charts are by definition a visual aid that summarizes a large block of information, usually in a list form of some sort, but there are different kinds of charts. We can have flow charts. Flow charts show the order or directional flow in which processes occur. They may simply be labeled in shapes or arrows. Organizational charts show hierarchies and relationships to certain things. If you've ever worked in a corporation and on perhaps a bulletin board in the back, you've seen an organizational chart with a hierarchy of who does what jobs. That's going to be an organizational chart. Graphs are another type of visual aid that are commonly used. And a graph is just basically a visual aid used to show statistical trends and patterns. There are many different types of graphs, but we have line graphs. And that's a graph that uses one or more lines to show changes in statistics over time or space. We have bar graphs. Bar graphs are a graph that uses vertical or even horizontal bars to show comparisons among 2 or more items. So a line graph is the line that kind of shoots up a chart. Bar graphs are going to be actual bars that show up on the chart. Pie graphs are a graph that highlights segments of a circle to show simple distribution patterns. And then we can also sometimes have picture graphs. These are rare, but we do have them. And that it presents data in pictures, each picture representing a number of individual cases. Diagrams, maps, and just so much more can be used for visual aids, so feel free to get creative with that. Visual aid tips, though, and I do think this is important because a lot of times we think that using a visual aid is just as simple as using it, but it's not. We always want to prepare visual aids well in advance so that we know that they work in our speech however we want them to work. We want to keep the visual aid simple. Don't make it where it has so much information that the person is focusing so hard on understanding the visual aid that they lose track of what your message is telling them. Make sure that the visual aids are large enough that they can be seen by everyone in the audience. Sometimes we make these teeny tiny little visual aids and not everyone can see them. That can be a distraction. You want to use a limited amount of text on the visual aid. You want to use fonts and colors effectively, not overpowering. Use images strategically. Make sure that the visual aid has a purpose. If it doesn't have a purpose, you don't need to use it. It's better to use no visual aid at all rather than a poor visual aid. You only want to display the visuals when you're discussing them. Always avoid passing around a visual aid because that just becomes such a distraction. Explain visual aids clearly and concisely. Talk to your audience, not the visual aid. I love this one because a lot of times when you're using a visual aid, we tend to talk to the chart. We'll turn around and talk to the chart rather than pointing out things on there and talking to our audience. We want to avoid doing that. Rehearse using your visual aids. This will make using the aid a lot more natural for you. Don't be too extreme with visuals. Audience members will feel like they're violated if you're too extreme with your visual aid, and they again will shut down on you. You always want to check the room and equipment before you perform your speech because anything could happen. Equipment could be missing. I've had lectures before where I've went into face-to-face classrooms. I had the whole thing set up. I come in there to do the lecture that day, and someone had taken a cord off the computer, and I couldn't use my presentation aid that day. I couldn't use my PowerPoint, or I couldn't use my visual aid because something was missing. Always check the room in advance, prepare, and have a backup plan in place just in case something goes wrong. So with that being said, that pretty much wraps up our lecture for the week. As always, if you have any questions, you can contact me in the course using the email feature. Otherwise, you guys keep up the hard work. You're doing great, and I can't wait to see what you come up with next for me. Thank you.